Hi everyone, welcome to a remote episode of the Majlis. My name is Yasmin Khoyatlar, and with me today I have Bilal Saab. Bilal, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, of course. Pleasure.
Thanks. Bilal is head of the US Middle East practice and advisor in Scientific and Academic Council for Trends Research and Advisory. He's also an associate fellow at Chatham House, and he's an adjunct professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And Bilal is here to talk with us today about Saudi defense and particularly the Saudi defense transformation, which is something that we haven't addressed at all yet in the podcast. So I'm really curious to get into it. But before we start, maybe Bilal, you can tell us a little bit about how you got into this space in the first place.
Yeah, of course. First of all, Yasmin, thank you so much for having me on. And I've been following your podcast and the really interesting conversations. I think there's a lot of need, frankly, for engagements like this on what's happening right now in the kingdom. And I think your contributions are really stellar. So, how did I get into this space? Academic training and professional interests. Obviously, I've been studying international security for the past 22 years, which is when I left home, which is Lebanon for me. I was born and raised in Beirut. I came to the US 22 years ago, which means I'm actually 44 now. So yes, it's funny. It's like Lebanese American, like half my life in Lebanon, half my life in the United States so far. Hopped from one think tank to another in Washington, brief time in the Pentagon, during the Trump administration, helping oversee security cooperation in the region for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the time. And this very particular subject, Yasmin, in terms of what I'm going to call defense governance or defense institution building, very much was curious about, I would say, over the past decade or so. It's one of those incredibly unsexy, almost boring, subjects in defense. Everybody wants to talk about equipment and fighter jets and ships and all that, but few people really want to talk about what you and I are going to talk about today, which is the institutional fabric of defense. So, very much got into it for the past decade, written a lot about it. That was part of my job at the Pentagon as well. I've always been a defense geek, and obviously my region is the Middle East, given my background, and my calling, my mission all along has been to try to promote stronger defense relations between the United States and its Arab partners.
And was there a particular event that led you to spin into specializing in this space? So I'm thinking you said almost a decade, the announcement of the vision, the ascendance of the crown prince.
A particular event. I mean, on a personal level, just me observing the track record of U.S. military assistance in the region, which have been, dismal. Of course, some exceptions, but the norm is that they've been pretty bad. And so I've been trying to better understand why that's been the case, who's to blame, how much is the blame to be shared. So that's sort of the research interest that started it all for me. And then I started to see some processes in the region, including in the kingdom, which I think is the most fascinating. It's the largest, it's the most ambitious, and we're going to talk about it, obviously. Processes of defense reform, if you want to call them defense transformation, and they're rather unique. I mean, they had never really done anything like this before. And so who's better to try to understand that than people from the region, as opposed to some, Westerner, with all due respect, okay, who is going to tell the world what's happening in the region, as opposed to someone who's actually, from that culture, from that part of the world, has the access, has the network to do that. So, very selfishly, it was an opportunity for me to delve into that space and tell that story as impartially as possible, constructively criticizing it, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And let's define what we mean exactly by the Saudi defense transformation, right, before we dig further into it and placing it in historical and geographical context as well.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned it already, Yasmin. So this thing started, you got to give him credit. This thing started with the Crown Prince himself. Had he not been there in the scene, I don't think you would have seen any of this. Everybody wants to talk about Vision 2030, including yourself, for very understandable reasons. But preceding that process is something that very, very few people know about, which is the defense transformation process. And it started when Mohammed bin Salman ascended politically. I don't know when you want to put a finger on that. I don't know, 2015, 2016. And he developed a very strong interest in defense when he first started, right? Started making some interesting statements about we need to overhaul the entire defense sector, look at what our friends, in the United States and other places do and how we do it differently. We need to fight corruption. It's really fascinating, unprecedented statements by a Saudi official. So it started with him, and then the war in Yemen happened, which pretty much reinforced his entire aspiration, vision of overhauling the defense sector. I mean, you know that there were a lot of struggles in the battlefield, and that put under the microscope the entire, national security establishment of the Saudis. So I would say anytime around 2015, 2016, 2017, when the whole process started to really mature after 2017, when the Americans got involved and started to provide some advice, which we can talk about later, of course.
Mhm. And before we get into the involvement of the Americans, and obviously a very interesting time when the Trump presidency coincided with the announcement of Vision 2030, I wanted to understand a little bit more about how this fits into the overall plan of Vision 2030, because as you said, it almost precedes it a little bit as well.
Yeah. So let's just start conceptually speaking, right? In general terms, you can't pursue economic transformation, which is what the kingdom is doing, or significant economic reform, and you're the expert, so you can educate me on this, how you're going to try to diversify the economy and move away from fossil fuels. There's some really big ticket items in economics. You can't do any of that if you can't protect your borders, if you can't protect your sovereignty, and more specifically, you can't attract foreign direct investment when your country is being bombed, when urban centers are being bombed, airports. I mean, you remember during the Yemen war, you had incidents like that quite often. And so, conceptually speaking, defense transformation ties in a very integral manner to any kind of other national pursuit, be it economic transformation or anything like that. So first, secure a country. Like, that's the first order of business. And then if you really force me to directly link the defense transformation process to Vision 2030, I would mention a couple of items, beyond the national security. As you know, one of the elements of Vision 2030 was, with respect to defense, is to try to achieve by 2030 a target of 50% military production at home. There's a national security argument there, which is that, okay, we want to rely less and less on outsiders to acquire the equipment that we need to secure the kingdom. So it's a dependency issue. But then also there's an economic issue, right? If you could produce at home, okay, in a limited fashion at least, certain items that could be quite helpful for your armed forces, then that's a huge, economic win as well. So now, if you ask me, are they ever going to get to that target by 2030? I don't know, but I've always found it to be less realistic unless you really are very specific about which niche areas in defense and which industries in defense are we talking about. The larger platforms, the big ticket items in defense, I don't think they're going to be able to get to the 50% level. But maybe on the smaller scale stuff like drone production, maintenance, overhaul, stuff like that, that's more realistic. But that's the economic piece of the defense transformation process. And there's, of course, the national security one. We want to be less dependent on the Americans, less dependent on European powers, and start to produce at home and get into joint ventures, partnerships, and utilize more effectively the offset programs that they have with the United States and the Brits and the French.
And would you say that this is unique to, this point in time in history for Saudi? So the argument can be made that, Saudi has been invested in its defense for a long time. What makes this moment and this transformation overall so important and so unique?
Just given, Yasmin, given the scale given the comprehensiveness, given the ambitious nature of it all, yes, it is quite unique. It doesn't mean that they've never tried to reform certain aspects of the civilian sector with the Ministry of Defense and then the armed forces on the military side of things. Of course, that's always, part of the defense journey of any nation. But nothing of this nature, again, all encompassing across the board, everything related to human capital, defense resource management, acquisition, logistics. I mean, literally, they are overhauling everything. You're starting from scratch. I mean, this is one of the things that I talk about in my chapter in my book on Saudi, which is overhauling everything, right? And so, yes, it is rather unique. It is certainly a very opportune time to do something like this, given the changing strategic landscape in the Middle East, the evolving, priorities of the kingdom, and the fact that they're in a very good space right now with the United States to do this together with them. Although, once again, we can talk about that later. So, long story short, yes. Yeah, definitely unique given how ambitious, comprehensive, and really challenging it is, encompassing all sectors, all functions of the defense ministry and the armed forces.
So we're talking, we're using big words. We're talking a lot about how ambitious it is, how much scale it's driving. Can we unpack that and talk a little bit about actually what this transformation entails? So where are we starting? What is the end goal? I know you mentioned a little bit about localization of production, but it's much larger than that. What are our priorities for the next 5, 10 years?
Yeah. So, believe it or not, it started off with 300 plus initiatives. This is how big, right? I mean, typically you think of, priorities when it comes to reform in any sector. I don't care if political, economic, defense. You think of like at least, anywhere from 5 to 10. This is like 300, which tells you that first, there was a recognition that we really need to overhaul everything. And then second, that in order to get to where we want to be as a kingdom, being able to protect ourselves and, secure our borders and achieve at least some of the economic goals that we have set out in Vision 2030, we need to hit every single priority of these. Now, I don't know where they are today in terms of the 300 plus. I mean, I'm hoping that, that number has gone down and that some things have actually been accomplished. Although it's a process, right? It's a journey, almost like a marathon. Like it almost never ends, right? You're continuously reforming, consolidating the gains, and then finding a new challenge that you want to accomplish. But to simplify it, and I don't want to oversimplify it. So the reform process is tackling both spaces: the civilian space, which is the Ministry of Defense, okay, and then there's the armed forces. On the civilian side of things, there's an entirely new organizational structure. So just like any other business, any organization that you can think of, where you go to the website and check, organizational structure, like, who is at the top of whom, the hierarchy, authorities, responsibilities, who's in charge of what. There's an entirely new structure in the Ministry of Defense, right? People in charge of acquisition are different, procurement, who's doing accounting, who's doing human resource development. All of those things now have new personnel, new structures, many of which are actually inspired by models in the United States and also in the UK, right? Naturally, because of the advice that the Saudis have received are from personnel who are American and British, okay? On the military side of things, there's an effort to, once again, keep it brief. There's an effort to achieve something that is absolutely critical to any armed forces around the world, at least those that are just aspiring, which is to become much more joint, right? So you go to the battlefield not as an army or as navy or as Marines or special operations or, Air Force. No, you go to the battlefield as a joint force, right? And that concept was dramatically deficient in the Saudi armed forces. And not to pick on the Saudis, pretty much everybody in the Middle East, frankly, and many other nations, middle-sized, outside the Middle East, because this is sort of I would say, the North Star of any military, to become joint and to fully utilize your resources and work in unison whenever there's a contingency, there's a crisis, and the different branches of your military are working together to achieve a common mission. Okay, so that concept of jointness has pretty much had been a key feature of everything they've been trying to do on the military side of things, right? There's a very challenging educational process, right? First, like culturally speaking, as a military, you have to understand what jointness means first. And once you digest that as on a conceptual level, then you have to be able to actually execute it, right, on the field. And this is challenging for a military that's never done it before, right? There are certain standards they have to follow, what we call the NATO standards, right? This is almost like getting a badge. Like once you get NATO certified, that means like you pretty much achieved the highest levels. They've had those standards separately in each branch of the military, like the Saudi Air Force. They get their own standards as a result of years of training with the Americans and so on and so forth, with the Brits. But then there's a standard for jointness. And having to learn that new language and practice it in real life has been perhaps the most fascinating development in Saudi defense transformation on the military side of things, right? On the civilian side, like I told you, a new organizational structure, a lot of responsibilities, different personnel, and all that. But there's one thing that's also fascinating, which you see also in other countries in the Gulf, but more so, I believe, in Saudi, because it's the largest in the Gulf, obviously. Female workforce that is actually now involved in the Ministry of Defense with different roles, right? And of course, that was recognized by the Crown Prince at the very beginning. That's one of the things that I found actually to be really exciting, because you just don't see enough of that in the region, whether in the Gulf or the broader region, which is the involvement of the female community in matters of national security, and specifically in defense. A lot of the positions that you see in the Saudi Ministry of Defense today are occupied by females who, frankly, are better trained than the males when it comes to human resources, accounting, anything that has to do with the budget, and communications, and so on and so forth. They come with some really interesting backgrounds that are applicable to defense, even though they don't come from defense backgrounds, obviously. And I don't need to tell you, Yasmin, the implications for involving women in the broader Saudi economy. So it's been a major pillar or feature of Vision 2030. And what I want to say here is that it's also something that you're seeing in the defense space and in the defense transformation process.
Who are the other players involved within this space? So who are the partners helping Saudi Arabia through this defense transformation, whether that's, governments, private sector, organizations, what have you?
Right. It's so nice. I can hear the adhan in the background. Reminds me of my time in Beirut. You will not be shocked to hear that it's the long-standing partners of the kingdom who are involved in this process, right? So those who used to provide equipment, provide advice on defense, they're the ones who now are leading the advisory effort with the kingdom, and that, of course, is the United States and the United Kingdom. I am okay with that format. Okay. I'm going to have some concern about it. I'm okay because us and the Brits, we speak the same language, more or less. So I'm not worried as much about interoperability issues. I'm not worried about a completely different system. Like, for example, the Saudis tomorrow decide, you know what, screw this. We don't want to partner with the Americans on this defense transformation process. We're going to go with the Chinese. Then it's an entirely different model, entirely different language and lexicon, and so that would become a huge problem. The Brits and the Americans, roughly similar, with some distinctions, of course. The Saudis were inspired by the Brits in certain elements of this new organizational structure that I told you about in the Ministry of Defense. They modeled some of those agencies and structures after British ones. And you got to remember, of course, some Saudi officers also go to the UK to train and get their education and so on and so forth. But I think at the forefront of this entire advisory effort still is the Americans. And there you've got two major stakeholders. There's the United States government, which is providing advice to the Saudis through contractors, or what we call defense institution building experts, right? And that whole started with I think the year 2017, right? So they've been on and off going to the kingdom with some interruptions. Of course, then COVID happened, so that also further delayed the process. It's not where it should be, if you ask me, but at least it's there, right? It just needs someone to pour more gasoline into that fire from at least the American side. And then the other part of it is the private sector. There's a good bit of private sector activity happening in the kingdom that is providing defense advisory services to the kingdom. And this is my biggest concern. My concern is not the US-British involvement. It's the almost dominance of the private sector in the kingdom, the US private sector in the kingdom, that is providing defense advisory services to the Saudis. Why am I concerned about it, if you may ask? Because I would rather have the US government at the forefront in the driver's seat, as opposed to the other way around, which is where in the back seat and the private sector is at the forefront. Why is that a problem? Well, because you know very well that the private sector is motivated by different concerns. Now, motivated by profit. I don't care how patriotic they are. I don't care how much they care about the U.S.-Saudi relationship overall. I'm sure they do. But at the end of the day, they're motivated by one thing and one thing only, which is to generate profit and revenues, right? And I want the bigger picture, the strategic context to be really dominating this conversation when it comes to defense transformation. I don't want business to be really driving this conversation. Now, there's a opportunity for a partnership, and there has been on some level between the private sector and the United States government. They sort of coordinate, they consult. There's certain things that the private sector in the kingdom can't do without consulting with the U.S. government, certain licenses, certain approvals, and blah blah blah. But it's not where it should be, obviously. And I'd rather, in that balance of power, if you want to call it, I'd rather that balance shift heavily in favor of the U.S. government as opposed to the private sector. The problem is we're not there yet. We're not well prepared as the U.S. government to actually be at the forefront, which is exactly why the private sector has stepped in and taken on this opportunity, because they're filling the gap, right? And you got to remember, when you talk about the U.S. government, that means whenever there are political tensions, which there have been, of course, over the past few years with Saudi, then that trickles down all the way to, security cooperation, defense advisory, and all that. The private sector doesn't care. The private sector is always there, regardless of what the politics are in Washington, unless there are very clear, guidance not to work with the Saudi government, which there are always limits to that, obviously. But that's the challenge with the U.S. government. The politics have to be right, first and foremost. And then you got to be well equipped yourself as the U.S. government to provide the right kind of advice to the Saudis that they think really fits into their defense transformation process. So we've had a lot of tensions in the conversation. I know the Saudi personnel, I know the American personnel, so I'm very much plugged into that conversation, which is why the private sector has come in and said, all right, okay, we'll clean this up and we will provide you exactly what you want, even though we know that some things actually are not exactly in your interest. But since you are you're the customer and you're the client, then you're always right, which is not necessarily the case, of course, in defense.
So what you're saying is the Saudis have had to essentially resort to American private sector companies because they're not getting what they need from the U.S. government.
Not getting enough, yes. And just to amplify the whole process, I mean, funding is not an issue, okay, in Saudi. So I might as well get as much advice as possible. But sorting this out and managing this has been a challenge. Like, how much do we lean on the private sector? How much do we lean on the U.S. government? Can we rely on the U.S. government to provide us with whatever we need? And so you need someone in the kingdom, okay, no one else, someone Saudi, to try to figure out, how do I manage these conversations? And how much do I get from the private sector and how much do I get from the U.S. government? And can I have the U.S. government and the private sector actually talk to each other, right? Mm-hmm. This is not an easy job, and that person doesn't exist. That person, that organization, that entity, whatever, doesn't exist. It's been primarily, Dr. Samir, who is a senior advisor, of course, to the Crown Prince and to his brother, Prince Khalid, the defense minister. his deputy, Dr. Khalid Bayari, these are people that I know personally. These guys have been spearheading this sort of this process of defense transformation, but they definitely need a lot of help. And there are a lot of good, skilled, ambitious people working with them, but it's just not enough.
And it doesn't help, of course, as you mentioned, the U.S.-Saudi relationship has been so tumultuous in the past 10 years or so. As we look forward and we seem to be, knock on wood, on a much steadier path, how do you see that relationship evolving?
So you mean the relationship overall? It doesn't have really to do with the defense transformation process.
No, well, how a steadier relationship would affect the defense transformation.
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right that this relationship is certainly improving and it's on the ascendancy, and I expect it to continue to flourish during the second term of the Trump administration. What implications will this improved relationship have for the defense transformation process? The honest answer is I don't know, because there are certain things, or I'm going to call it requirements for success, that should exist no matter who's in charge in the White House. Okay? Now, I am happy and I welcome the fact that we're going to have a second term for the Trump administration, because at least at the very high level, you know that the political atmosphere is going to be positive and it's going to be enabling a lot of good things. But it doesn't mean specifically that it's actually going to pay close attention to the Saudi defense transformation process. As you very well know, they're going to focus on bigger things. And those bigger things might have positive implications for the defense transformation process. The bigger things are, and you've heard it in the news all over, the Mutual Defense Pact, right? The Mutual Defense Pact, which means we protect you, you protect us, kind of like a NATO Article 5. Official, commitment, formal, on paper, something that the United States has with not a single country in the Middle East, minus Turkey, because they're a NATO member, of course. Believe it or not even with Israel. If that were to happen, and I'm not going to bore you with the requirements of that because they're all over the news, right? I mean, the Saudis have to normalize with the Israelis have to agree to a two-state solution. So let's just put aside all that and pretend for a moment that we are there, okay? That we are in a full-fledged treaty alliance with Saudi Arabia that includes a mutual defense pact. With that kind of a high-level agreement, boy, could it be useful to try to translate that into something that will actually have positive implications for the defense transformation process. Let me explain very briefly what I mean by that. When you enter into a mutual defense pact with any other nation, that means that you are also obligated to defend them in the event of any contingency, right? So, and this is something that has been sort of underemphasized in the news, is that, oh yeah, the Americans will provide a security commitment to the Saudis. Yes, but the Saudis also have to provide a security commitment to the Americans whenever their forces in the Middle East are attacked. Because let's not kid ourselves. If there's an attack on the U.S. homeland, Saudi Arabia is not going to come to the rescue of the United States. The commitment is to the U.S. forces who are based in the kingdom or based in the region, right? If there's an attack against them. So if that were to happen, here's the question. Is Saudi Arabia realistically in a position to fulfill that role? Can they actually provide that security commitment to the Americans if that contingency arises? This is where the defense transformation process is integral to that conversation. Because this is what the whole point of the defense transformation process is: to reform the armed forces, to make them stronger, to make them more efficient, more effective, and better able to contribute to collective security interests, which will be part and parcel of a mutual defense pact. You see? So with that high-level agreement, strategic agreement, such as a mutual defense pact, then boy, I can take that and try to translate it in ways that could be incredibly useful for all those requirements that are needed for succeeding in the defense transformation process. Because absent that at the higher level, there will always be limits to what you can do on the ground, be it private sector, be it U.S. government, on defense transformation with the Saudis. Imagine, like, I just opened a ginormous door for you for cooperation because of this mutual defense pact. Now it's up to you, United States Central Command, so CENTCOM, and anybody who's involved in this process from the civilian side, defense management specialists, all of that, take that and go translate it into something good that could actually make the Saudis stronger, more effective, more efficient with their military power.
This is, of course, all contingent on the defense pact being signed by both parties, which, as the year has gone on, less and less likely, but maybe a new administration will bring fresh energy to it.
Yeah, I mean, did you see that piece of news yesterday by Haaretz, which I think is fake news, that, oh yeah, there's major breakthrough agreement on normalization between Saudi Arabia, and I'm not picking on Haaretz, I like them. But no, they're not even close. As a matter of fact, Saudi Arabia has been quite consistent on what's required to achieve normalization, and I don't see any breakthroughs absent serious concessions on the part of the Israelis towards the two-state solution. So we're not there yet, no.
Agreed. And in light of that, perhaps it's better to focus right now in this conversation on, what Saudi's been able to accomplish so far. So what would you say have been some of the major accomplishments of the, almost past 10 years of the defense transformation plan?
Yeah, so to summarize it, Yasmin, I think you have to start with human capital. You got to remember, folks who are now working in the Saudi Ministry of Defense, who are bringing in fresh new talent, they had to be trained in, lack of a better word, what you call defense studies, right? They brought them from the private sector, the oil and gas sector, right? Aramco and other places, business backgrounds, and you had to convert them into defense people, which has been challenging, right? You come with a certain background, with certain training, and now you have to think completely differently, right? From a business perspective into a national security defense perspective. But there's been major strides in that effort, right? So the most important ingredient of any kind of transformation process, be it economic, political, defense, is always, it starts with human capital. I mean, the people who are actually undergoing this process. And so to create that cadre, to create that community of defense people in the kingdom has been A, the most challenging, B, the most rewarding since this whole thing started. Because they are really training people from scratch, and they're occupying these very sensitive and important positions in the Saudi Ministry of Defense. So that's major accomplishment number one, and that of course includes women participating in that effort. Two is acquisition. Okay, what do I mean by acquisition? Basically, when you contract with foreign powers to bring in military equipment that would be used by the Saudi armed forces. That was a huge disaster in the past. It was the one sector that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman targeted at the very beginning as ripe for corruption, and it had to be reformed, right? Back in the day, princes used to use various government agencies in the Saudi sector as sort of their own personal fiefdoms, like their own ATM machines, frankly. And so that had to be completely overhauled with new regulation, organizational bodies that provide oversight, monitoring, evaluation, kind of like at least a version of the American system with the PPBE. And so coming up with how do you come up with a defense budget, right, from A to Z? And so all of that, they've made major strides in terms of acquisition. And as you know, Yasmin, they created two bodies, agencies, not too long ago that have very much a say in this entire process. They're called GAMI and SAMI. GAMI is more on the regulatory side, the government side, policies and all that. SAMI is the more manufacturing arm that is supposed to get that target of 50% domestic production by 2030, right?
Across the whole
and then
supply.
recently they created GAD also, which is the General Authority for Defense and Development, which is kind of like their own. If I were to compare it to the Defense Innovation Unit in the United States, right? There's that entity within the Pentagon that is focused on innovation. How do you build an ecosystem of innovation? The Saudis have learned from that, and they created their own, and they're trying to create their own ecosystem of innovation through GAD. So acquisition has been a major reform element, which they've made great strides in. They've institutionalized it, they've streamlined it. Of course, there's still plenty of opportunities for inefficiencies, but that's frankly the case with any other country. The jointness piece that I told you about, which is quite critical for the armed forces in Saudi Arabia, the joint training, the mentality of thinking together, right, as a team, as opposed to, okay, I'm Air Force, I'm not going to talk to anybody in the Navy, or I'm not going to talk to anybody in the Army. and the cooperation between the civilians and the military, right? Two vastly different cultures, and believe me, this is not unique to Saudi Arabia. This is like the case with any other country, including first world countries like the United States, fully developed. There's always a tension, no matter what, between civilians and the military when it comes to defense. I mean, there's a whole, obviously, scholarship on civil-military relations, in the world, and there's always issues between them. But there's now greater convergence in Saudi Arabia between these two communities. In the past, they didn't even talk to each other, right, at all. And there was very little trust between them. Now there seems to be some kind of a similar language that they're going through. Of course, all of that facilitated, led by the two individuals that I told you about, Dr. Samir and Dr. Khalid Biari, and their lieutenants, of course. Logistics, major strides in logistics in terms of streamlining, making them much more efficient, storage facilities, digitization. Always have a problem saying that word. And you could tell that has also economic implications. Whenever you're efficient in a certain sector, that has, very positive effects on other sectors. Maintenance, repair, and overhaul. They're trying to really localize this and become really experts in that, so that they don't have to, depend on external, contractors or foreign governments to do that for them. They still need help, obviously, but there's a good bit of localization when it comes to maintenance, overhaul, and repair, which is saving some money, right? And then last but not least, what we call, this is where I'm going to get a little bit wonky, but forgive me. Joint capability planning, right? So this is when you are planning what your next capabilities are going to be for the next 5 years, 10 years, in each sector, right? And that's a very difficult process. That's a very difficult journey. Only the most advanced defense establishments around the world know how to do these things. They're laborious. They're very collaborative within your own, Ministry of Defense, your defense establishment. And so it requires a lot of coordination with different agencies, different voices, having a say in terms of what the shape of your military is going to be 10 years from now. What capabilities do you need to address a multitude of threats? I mean, the defense space, Yasmin, as you very well know, is rapidly evolving, frankly, like no other sector, with the advent of autonomous weapons, with the advent of artificial intelligence. You're seeing those things in the commercial sector, obviously in economics, but in the defense space, it really, truly is revolutionizing how people are thinking about war and how they're approaching war. And so when you think about capabilities, you have to understand how do you integrate those new elements, and that takes quite an effort, takes a good bit of skill to get into those things in ways where, frankly, the Saudis before didn't really think about those things on their own. They pretty much looked at, what kind of equipment can we get, and then try to make them fit into their own doctrine, into their own strategy. Now it's the other way around. You start with a strategy, you start with where do you want to be, and then you bring in the equipment. And that change in culture, that shift in culture, has been tremendously helpful for the Saudis.
Not to, paint too rosy of a picture, we can also talk a little bit about, what are some of the challenges, the blocks to maturity that we're facing to be able to reach the goals that we have, or even if those goals are realistic, is also a fair question to ask. I think, are there other countries that are more developed in their defense industries that we could potentially see Saudi modeling themselves off of if we're not going to reach, 100% localization or even 50% anytime soon?
Right. So every single reform element that I just told you about, let's just say, if you reach 100%, then you're good. I mean, they're probably somewhere in the 40 to 50%, which means that the challenges are to how do you get to the 100%, right? In every single area where they're trying to reform, be it human capital, logistics, acquisition, strategy, doctrine, you name it. They're nowhere near where they want to be, obviously, which is why they have this target of, 2030 and probably even beyond. And, to be fair to the Saudis, this process, unfortunately, never stops. It's not like you ever reach a level where you're like, you know what, I'm good. I'm never going to stop. I'm going to stop reforming because I've hit all my marks. No, I mean, national security is continuously evolving. It is something that you have to continuously adapt to. And so this process, sadly, it never ends, right? you could become much more efficient about it. This is where it becomes really interesting for the Saudis, and start make some savings and become a lot more efficient in your programmatic side of things in defense, and then also on how do you operate, employ, and so on and so forth. And you get into the sustainment piece, which is fascinating always. The sustainment is the most difficult part. This is where armies fall or prosper, right? You can go into a battlefield and you could be fantastic in the first 5 minutes, and the next half an hour you're pretty much running out of gas because everything else that you've used in the first 5 minutes, essentially you've exhausted, right? I mean, you saw some of that in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? The first few days, I mean, we thought the whole thing was over, right? I mean, they were going to march into Kiev and the war was going to end. But this, obviously as the war dragged and it became a war of attrition, this is when the issue of sustainment became incredibly important. And this is where the Russians essentially were pretty weak, right? Because they didn't think about logistics well, they didn't think about all sorts of issues that would sustain the fight. This is what the Saudis also have to think about, especially as they consider the example of the Yemen war, which lasted for a number of years. Sustainment becomes a huge issue, right? To go back to your question, what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
So what are countries that we could potentially see Saudi modeling them within?
Yes. So beyond the Americans and the Brits, that's a good question. So I think on the defense institutional side of things, I think it would be a mistake. I'm biased, of course, but it would be a big mistake if you change that set of partnerships and replace them with something else, be it Russian, be it Chinese. I mean, those are essentially the two candidates, because the Europeans are essentially the same as the Brits and the Americans. But in terms of size, and I'm sure this is an ongoing conversation in the Saudi Ministry of Defense, like how large you want the Saudi armed forces to be. I've always advocated for quality as opposed to quantity, right? It doesn't have to be a very large, army in Saudi Arabia. So you can model your army after the Israelis, after the Swedes, some of the Nordic countries who go for technological edge and especially aerial supremacy, with a really competent Air Force, and now integrating autonomous systems into that, as opposed to having a very large land-based army and so on and so forth. Now, there are two aspects about Saudi defense that one is good and one is bad. The bad is that it's a large country, which means that your borders have to be defended, especially on the Red Sea, Yemen, southern. So you do need, at least a sizable, large enough ground-based contingent to fulfill that mission. The good thing is that you do have strategic depth. Unlike those smaller countries like Israel and the smaller Nordic countries, they don't have strategic depth, which means that they cannot afford to fight on their own soil. They have to try deter conflict as much as possible to prevent it from happening in the first place. But then if it does happen, try to fight outside your territory, right? Saudi Arabia doesn't necessarily have that problem. I'm not saying that they should fight inside Saudi territory, but they don't necessarily have that problem. They're not like UAE, they're not like Qatar, they're not like Bahrain, obviously. They're much bigger and sort of they can afford digesting some hits like they have during the war in Yemen, obviously when some urban centers were, being attacked and so on and so forth. So I would, if I were, in the Saudi shoes, and I think they're already thinking about that, when it comes to capability planning, I would model my capabilities after those of the Israelis. To some extent, like I said, some of the Nordic countries. But the last thing you want to do is model it after, the Americans or something like that. There's just dramatic differences between us. And at the end of the day, the mission of the Saudi armed forces is not expeditionary, in the sense that Saudi Arabia doesn't have a history or a philosophy of deploying troops outside Saudi territory. They are there to defend the nation. They are there to provide territorial defense. And so that expeditionary mindset, when you saw it in Yemen, it was an exception. It was not the norm in Saudi history, right? And so all you have to do is just come up with the right kind of force structure to defend the kingdom and all of its borders from the north with the Levantine, set of threats, and the south with the maritime threats coming from the Houthis and, of course, the Persian Gulf. That is a more manageable mission when it comes to defense. Unlike the United States, which is a global power with global power projections, they have to protect their interests all over the place. The Saudis just have to defend the homeland. That's pretty much it. It is a big homeland, but
you're preempting my question there, which is going to be, I think you answered the capability side well, but then from a strategy perspective, right? So obviously not like the US, but Saudi has had stints of being a bit expansionary, right? So you have Yemen, you had not quite the same, but the blockade with Qatar, and then in recent years we've taken sort of a bit more of an isolationist, just protect our borders approach. Do you see that continuing? It seems like you think that's the right move, but just to check.
So, look, in Saudi defense, the expeditionary, moment, let's call it, in Yemen was sort of forced on them. It's not like they wanted to go to Yemen. I mean, the whole takeover of Sana'a and that whole crisis in Yemen forced the Saudis to fight inside Yemen, and even in a very limited fashion. For a brief period of time in coordination with the UAE, as you very well know in the history of that conflict. But they sort of have different, at the time, even then, they had different missions. I mean, they barely directly fought together, right? I mean, they were there as a coalition, diplomatically speaking. And of course, there was some communication on the ground between Saudi and Emirati forces, but there was very little actually joint fighting between them. They almost had like different missions and different sets of adversaries, right? I don't expect that mentality or that philosophy of expeditionary or like deploying troops outside Saudi territory to come back. I think that the priority today, which is where you obviously follow closely, is economic transformation. And that in itself requires, as we started this conversation, with security at home, protecting the borders, protecting the homeland. Whatever ambitious ideas were in the beginning of the rule of Crown Prince Mohammed, I think those have dissipated. I think that this is now much more insular. I don't want to say isolationist, much more insular. And frankly, the whole premise of entering into a full-fledged alliance with the United States is to reinforce that. It's not to go on aggressive pursuits and like military conflicts overseas, and people should be worried about that. No, not at all. This really is just another protective layer for the kingdom to continue doing its number one priority, which is economic transformation. I mean,
and I think, as you mentioned, the economic diversification, it rests on the contingency is safe borders, but beyond that, it's also a safe region. So is there something Saudi can do about the larger Middle East strife, or is that just going to be a hit that we're going to have to take economically, particularly as we focus so much on tourism?
Whatever contributions I see, Yasmin, are going to be primarily diplomatic in order to promote regional security. I don't think, once again, that mindset of what happened in Yemen, I don't think you're going to see that down the road, unless, once again, you are in a mutual defense pact with the Americans and you're sort of obligated legally to protect U.S. forces if they were ever to be attacked. But even that contingency sort of has a very low likelihood.
Right. So it seems like to sum it up, the best thing for Saudi right now is to focus on capabilities and within our borders and on diplomatic primarily.
Yeah. This is what you call combat readiness, right? And it has two layers or two elements to it. Structural readiness. So I am structurally sound. I have the infrastructure. I have the foundation, right? Just like any other entity, business. Like you don't just focus on profits and how do you sell your product. You have to have a solid institutional infrastructure, right? That would allow you to actually sell that product and that would allow you to compete with other companies and so on and so forth. It's the same thing in defense, right? So once you're solid internally with a proper foundation, with a proper infrastructure, let's just call it the back end, right? Let's call it the back end. You're kind of like developing a website. If your back end is really good, then the website is going to look fantastic, right? Let's continue to do that. because that itself is going to have a direct effect on your operational readiness, which is what you use when shots are fired, when you are in the battlefield. So strengthen yourself as much as you can so that, God forbid, whenever there's another contingency, another crisis, another war, you are much better prepared to, A, reduce the effects of it on you, and you are better able to protect yourself. Saudi Arabia went into Yemen wholly unprepared, and they learned that. And they're trying to digest those lessons.
And when we think to the future, I guess, any final words of advice for those looking into the Saudi defense industry?
See, the difficulty with people who have a nerdy interest like me in this transformation process is that there's very little about it. I mean, you can read my publications. I've written a lot about it myself, but I have been absolutely fortunate and privileged to have that kind of access where I could speak to people who are involved both on the American side and on the Saudi side. But more broadly speaking, I think that there's a dearth in scholarship on not just in Saudi Arabia when it comes to defense transformation and defense reform, but across the region. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening also in the UAE, which precedes the Saudi defense transformation process, right? They've been on this journey earlier than the Saudis, and they've also had a lot of accomplishments, and they've made great strides in a lot of the things that you and I talked about today, except that there's very little out there that is credible, at least, right? And doesn't go into, oh my God, there is just a major human rights violator, forget about what they're doing, right? So if you have an open mind and you have a military perspective on how these things are operating, forget about the politics, then there's a lot to learn there that could be really interesting for the field of defense studies or military studies, strategic studies. And we need to start getting into that space because we expect these partners to contribute a whole lot more to regional security. And how are we going to expect them if we don't understand how they operate? If we don't understand their systems and how they think and how they are reforming and what kind of help they need, somebody needs to be observing, monitoring, analyzing, writing about these things. I have been absolutely fascinated with this entire process, but you need a whole lot more people from the region. Like, for example, Yazid Sayef from Carnegie. I mean, I love Yazid, and he is also very much interested in these issues, but we need a lot more Yazids out there, right? And so that's my piece of advice for people like me, defense analysts, to just try to better understand how these countries are reforming and go beyond these lazy, frankly, short-sighted theories of, oh, it will never reach its potential because they never want to form armies that could one day topple them. Like, there's a whole lot more than that. Okay, there's that used to be dominating thesis that they will never get serious about this because they fear their militaries more than they fear their external threats. That is so not true. That is so not true, and they understand that now better than any other time that they need to rely on themselves, they being the countries in the region, far more than at any other point in history, because they understand that the United States is shifting. The United States is never going to be there the way it used to be in the past, as the guardian, as the protector, as the policeman of the region. We have now geopolitical priorities that center on the Indo-Pacific. We are closely monitoring what China is doing in that part of the world. And so our attention, our resources also are declining in the Middle East, rightly or wrongly. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's a fact, right? And so me as a country in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, my priority is to try to think, speaking of diversification, right? How can I reduce my dependence on the United States and others while forming smarter partnerships with them that could allow me to boost my defense capabilities, better protect myself, and better guard against these threats that have proliferated over the past few years, be it, Iran, ISIS, and so on and so forth.
Right. You can see it as, a challenge, but you can also see it as an opportunity. The US's lessened presence in the Middle East for a
Yes.
chance for Saudi-US relationship to mature and enter a new stage of its life.
Exactly. It's the kind of pressure that's positive.
Yeah. Same as oil running out, I guess.
Yeah, well, there you go. Precisely.
Well, thank you so much, Bilal. And I hope whoever's listening has gotten more interested in looking into defense transformation in Saudi, and we can have more scholars come out of this. But it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, and good luck with the podcast. I really am very much interested in A lot of them, although I don't really understand much, economic transformation, but I learn a lot about, what's happening in the kingdom through your efforts. So thank you, and thank you for having me.
Cheers. Thank you.